podcast about Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. Today we are discussing The Lighthouse, directed by Robert Eggers, screenplay by Robert Eggers and Max Eggers. And to join me to talk about this mysterious, wonderful film, we're having Skylar back. Skylar.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Hunter.
Well, it's good to be back here. Thanks for being here. There's been a little bit of a hiatus. If anybody out there follows the show on Instagram or the Facebook page, first off, thank you. A small but steadily growing number of people on there, which is very good to see. But yeah, we had a little bit of a hiatus. December was taken off.
Yeah, pretty much. We decided after, it was just for the audience's perspective, it was our first year recording, and we considered very much the audience that we built up over that period of time to be a triumphant success. And for all of our sanity's sake, given how much of a wonderfully tiresome year 2019 was for the bulk of us, we decided to take the holidays off, and now we're back in full force, batteries recharged and ready to deliver a season 2 for everybody.
Well, and to address a lighthouse in the room, this is the second time we are recording this episode. Long story short, we did I think a decent, admirable job. This was, about a month and a half ago at this point?
I think so, yeah.
And then, in all candidness, I went and I done killed a seabird. And everything went to shit. So, after that, we just kind of threw up our hands. And because December is the worst month out of all the months, here we are. And to top it off, this was going to be recorded even earlier still, and we got a snowstorm. So we had to delay recording again.
Weather is going to be a topical discussion when discussing this movie, of course, but that darn Nova Scotia weather.
Well, that's what I thought when I was watching this. Imagine this in winter.
Oh, it just would have been absolutely
okay, brutal. We'll get to that later on. Yeah, that crossed my mind because when we previously recorded, I had just seen The Lighthouse in the cinema when it was finally released here. And now, because of researching the show, I've had a couple more times to watch it. So, yeah, I think we'll have some new things to say about it this time. We're not just going to be rehashing what we did before. A lot of perspective on the film, and also this is a movie that when you watch multiple times you start taking different things away. So before we get ahead of ourselves, Skylar, what is The Lighthouse?
Okay, so The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is a psychological drama. It's a film directed by Robert Eggers, starring Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe. It's more of a psychological drama than anything else. It's also been classified as a horror film, but I think the jury's still out on whether or not that's actually a true statement or not. It's as much a historical drama and Shakespearean dialogue-driven drama than a horror film, in my opinion. It's shot on beautiful black and white, film stock, and utilization of the harsh conditions of shooting in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. It's about two lighthouse keepers being at the mercy of complete isolation and the harshness of Mother Nature, going mad in the confines of a lighthouse.
You have a better memory than I have. There's no way I could have remembered all that.
Yeah, I had a little bit of time to prepare. I was actually about to bring up, I'm actually glad we're recording this again because I just have as much information as I had the first time when we recorded this. I actually have doubly so now because it's the longer this movie sits with me, the more I realize how much of an impact it had on me.
Definitely, yeah. We had a little bit of pre-show banter about it that we shut down. The one thing I do want to get out of the way, because this is a first for this podcast, this is not technically a Canadian film.
That's correct.
I don't think anybody in the cast, some background people, I believe the mermaid was Canadian.
Yes.
Again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. You know, the director, the screenwriters involved in it, the leads are not Canadian. I do not believe it was financed by any Canadian backing at all.
No, but it was actually all completely, the production side of things was all carried by a Nova Scotian crew. Which is a huge part of the funding that was involved with making of The Lighthouse, which is something...
Which Eggers gushed about.
Oh, yeah,
he had
big
nothing
time.
But fantastic things to say about.
Oh, he said they were, the Nova Scotian crew were all incredible, which is obviously like an elephant in the room or a lighthouse in the room, not to steal your joke, but
that's for the world.
That's right.
The world can use that from now on.
As it turns out, this movie, and the reason why we decided to talk about this and why it's so vital to, I think, do this and cover this on North of Normal is because it's a Nova Scotian production.
And in case this is your first episode, we do record this in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was a little bit of a local treat for us in a lot of ways. So there's a little bit of a communal sort of celebration of viewing this movie and making sure that everyone got out to support it, which I don't know if you're Hunter, if you want me to cover this part of it right now, but it's fair to bring up that Hallie and myself, and for those of you who don't know who Hallie is my co-host on the adjacent podcast, Silver Screen Anomalies. We're all under the same network here. We got to see the premiere, and Willem Dafoe and Robert Eggers were present at the screening. And that was a totally otherworldly experience for us, seeing the movie, of course, because of just how deafeningly mad this movie is. It's absolutely batshit insane. But also the experience of going to this premiere and then subsequently going to the gala, the after party afterwards.
Well, let's get to the gala a little bit later on, because I think that would be a really your experience there, I think, would be a really positive note to end on. Not that I think this will be a negative episode at all, but I think it would be a nice way to wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah. That sounds like a good idea.
So, man, The Lighthouse. I liked The Lighthouse when we watched it before, but there's something that just didn't sit right with me.
Yes.
I found intellectually, I had a very big distance from it, but I felt I wore this movie a lot. And the subsequent times that I've watched it since then, I've enjoyed it a lot more. And it's what I call, The Lighthouse to me is a portrait picture. That almost the plot and everything that happens is almost incidental. It's almost like everything that you watch on screen becomes a single static image. It's like staring at a painting and just watching the story of the painting unfold in front of you.
Yes.
This movie is so gorgeous. Every performance is so spot on. We don't have to go too much into this, but we're recording this on the day that the Academy Awards were announced.
Yes.
I will say The Lighthouse got nominated for cinematography.
Just cinematography.
But shut out for everything else. After watching this movie multiple times, and I want to say, having seen at least 3/4 of the nominated films in like the top 5 categories, plus the screenplay categories, every aspect that this film would be eligible for an award is better than most of the films that have been nominated.
I agree completely.
You take direction, you take acting, you take screenplay, you take set design, you take sound design. The sound design in this movie is nuts.
The sound of a foghorn has never been more haunting. It sears into your skull from the very opening shot, then in through the mist.
Yeah.
With the vessel coming into the island from the very first frame. This movie just sears that sound effect into your brain, and it never leaves.
Yeah.
It's a point of anxiety, not just for the characters, but also for the audience.
Yeah.
Because this very much, in a lot of ways, is a audience participation viewing experience. You get so involved in the isolation of these two characters that you go mad with them.
Well, part of my story about watching the movie is the fact that I watched it. If anybody's listened, well, we didn't really introduce you, but you recorded an episode, number 1, Ginger Snaps. If you want to know about Skylar, go listen to that.
Yeah.
Plugging ourselves.
Who
but I
needs
saw
to
it
know
with my roommate Spencer, who was previously on the podcast. He was here for Hobo with a Shotgun and also for Foo Bar. So go check those out. It's funny, after the movie, I turned to him and I was like, well, fuck, I think it's hilarious they made a documentary about our lives. Just these two dudes living together in close quarters, gradually driving each other crazy and, you know, in weird isolation, dealing with the weird mood issues and stuff like that.
Totally. I'm actually curious to, I guess, get a little bit of a deep dive into your psychology revolving around the interpretations of this movie. Because a big part of why this movie is so, I think, impressive and why it works so well is because there's many different ways that you can interpret this movie. It has many interpretations, and there's many ways that you can watch it. From my perspective anyway, because I've had two different, I guess, thought processes, two lines of thinking. There is a more literal way that you can interpret this, and then there's a very psychological and very hallucinogenic way that you can interpret this.
Yeah, well,
is there a way?
I'll keep going back to like the whole idea of it being a portrait picture,
right? And
very few films you can actually describe are like that. Like I think in the last year, Portrait of a Lady on Fire is very much this type of a movie.
Yeah.
Where I look back, you could argue. Well, let's go back. Citizen Kane, you could argue, is a portrait picture. You know, every little bit of information kind of adds to an overall emotional experience, which is much more than a point A to B sort of linear film. My story after watching this, and it's not really going to be a beat by beat plot discussion, I don't think, of this movie.
I don't think that. I think that would be a disservice to the audience, really.
I saw it, made the joke to Spencer. We saw it for people who live out in Halifax. I unfortunately saw it out in the cultural wasteland, which is Bayers Lake. So we were driving back, and I asked Spencer to just drop me off at the grocery store
Right.
down the way. Just
Yeah.
needed to pick up a few things. And we were discussing it, and like I said, I was feeling this sort of almost like an emptiness after watching it. It was much more of a technical exercise of watching the film. And I went into the grocery store, and it's the one down on Quinpool, which is really tight.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of room to move around in there. Oh, and of course, beforehand, I wasn't prepared, so I didn't have a bag.
Okay.
So, of course, I asked Spencer, I'm like, do you have like a bag or a reusable bag? He's like, oh, I should have something. And of course, because he's Spencer, he has like a long sort of tube rucksack
Yes.
in the back, the type that you picture strung up to be used as a punching bag. So I go into the grocery store, and maybe TMI for the audience, I do suffer from anxiety. It's something that I deal with, and I've sought help for. But man, the experience of seeing that movie, oh yeah, and it was Tuesday, which is student night,
Oh, yeah.
where students get like, with their student card, get like 15% off. So my anxiety when I leave that place is just running super high, and I'm wearing my jacket, that sort of like pea coat type jacket that I have, and I have my groceries in a rucksack, and it's slung over, and my hair is like coming down. It was when my hair was sort of kind of slicked back, but it would kind of come down and like that sort of 40s look. And I'm just kind of walking along, and I'm kind of hunched over, just feeling the sort of anxiety from the claustrophobia of the experience. And I'm crossing the road, and this girl is sitting there in her car, just staring at me. And I kind of stop for a second. I'm like, oh my God, I look like I'm from that fucking movie. Like I look like I'm from that. And as time went on in subsequent viewings, I came to understand the movie a lot more. And I know you have a lot more deeper feelings about this. My biggest takeaway, again, is a portrait picture. Loneliness is a bitch, and it'll kill you.
Yep.
Isolation will kill you. And you can be in the presence of somebody else and be isolated. You've been around the block enough. We've all been in a relationship at one point where you are in the same space with somebody, you know, for a good chunk of time out of the day, and you feel fucking alone. And your brain goes to weird spaces, especially when you're with somebody else, because you have that sort of feeling of alienation. That alienation is almost deepened and cuts deeper, because us being social animals, being around other people is supposed to make us feel better. But it can just alleviate and heighten, especially like in this movie, when you have two personalities that were maybe not meant to be in the same space together.
That's right.
And I have thoughts about that too, especially with the performances and watching it a second time to see how things play out. But I'm talking way too much. So that's my take. That's my take on it.
Okay, I'm about to go into a deep dive myself, because since even our last discussion, and again, you already mentioned that it's been about a month and a half, I have even more to take away from this movie on top of what I already took out of it the first time around. Because I, unlike you, I saw this movie twice, once in the theater, and it stuck with me for that long up until the point that I watched it again last night. So this is very fresh for me. This movie to me it's very much about, I mean, obviously there's some combinations of mythology in this. It goes without saying that this has a mythological aspect to it. Robert Eggers is infamous for incorporating mythology into his movies very organically, because his previous film, The Witch, which if you haven't seen that, I consider that to be easily one of the best horror movies of the past 10 years. That being said, mythology is something that is very intrinsically connected to a lot of his subject matter. He likes to weave that into his narratives. This movie, to me, is a mood piece that tells a story about two people who do not understand each other at all. There's a disconnect not only from society, and that's all done very well through the lens of the lighthouse itself, which is there's a lot of solitude, obviously, in this movie, and the isolation of the two of them being trapped in this very small set and this tiny island is obviously a visual motif that's used very widely to reinforce this feeling of isolation, but they're also isolated in their own heads. These two characters do not know themselves. There's a identity crisis between the two of them. Robert Pattinson's character... are we getting into spoilers? Is that something that we want to do, or do you want to keep things pretty loosey-goosey?
Spoiler warning, people. I want to talk about this movie.
Yeah, me too.
And not have to worry about it. If you haven't seen The Lighthouse, I don't think you can really spoil this movie that much.
Not particularly, because the thing is...
I'm not a spoiler person, so what do I know? But
this is an experience movie. This is an experience movie, and you're not losing anything by knowing anything about the plot. Because if I'm being perfectly honest with you,
just see this.
I can summarize the plot of this movie very quickly. It's two guys working a very slavish job in a period setting, going mad in a lighthouse. That's really it. But there's a lot more details. It's about the details in this movie, and
we're going to talk about details.
Good Lord, I don't even like. It's hard to even pinpoint where to start. But
finish your point.
Then
we'll get up. We're getting off track because I want to hear what you have to say.
Where I want to start is the characters, because it's really about these two characters, and I mean, it goes without saying that the two lead performances in this movie are absolutely incredible.
Astronomical. Again, put them against any other.
Yeah, they're just insane.
Like
both, and it's and I know Dafoe obviously gets a lot. He gets tooted a lot when talking about this movie, but Robert Pattinson goes toe to toe with him.
Oh no, I say Pattinson's a rock star.
He's insane in this.
He's
so
because
good.
he has this weird physicality.
Yes.
That I know this sounds cheesy and cliche, but reminded me of like a young Brando.
Yeah.
Like, like on the waterfront era, just this physicality that he carries with him, this intensity, just kind of pent up. And especially watching the performance a second time, and I do want to ask you what you think is actually going on between them later. But his performance, there's just something always going on.
So
whereas Dafoe is kind of like more of like a character, like an imp.
Yeah.
That's kind of poking him. And this time it was like, would Pattinson have gone as crazy if it wasn't for Dafoe poking him all the time? You know what I mean? Like he comes on like the island like a wounded dog. You see it on his face. You know?
I have an interpretation of this that's kind of interesting. Now, is this my definitive interpretation? No, because I guarantee you if I watch this movie again, I'm going to change my interpretation altogether. But this is a detail that's worth noting. So as I mentioned, this movie is about two men who have an identity crisis, who are very disconnected from themselves. For example, like both of these men are lying about who they are. That's a given plot element. Very obvious as the plot unravels that Dafoe's character didn't have much of a past at all as a seasoned sailor, as much as he likes to boast about it, which plays into one of the other thematic elements of the movie, which is toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Basically driven into your skull right down to the visual symbolism of the lighthouse itself, which is obviously even written in the script. I actually uncovered online. It was written in the script that it was supposed to be a very phallic reference. It's an erect.
I would like to read that. Yeah.
It's an erect penis, essentially. I guess there's a little bit of playing on homoeroticism in this movie.
Only a little bit.
Only a little bit. Like it's something that I didn't really grasp the first time, but it really grasped the second time, and it's actually very playful and fun, and it works its way into the script really well.
Oh yeah, like this is a funny movie too.
It's like, shockingly funny.
Conversations can often steer to this place that you think you're in this sort of bleak experience. Like I was chuckling to myself for about a good third of the movie.
Absolutely.
And again, the performances just really revolve on that.
These two characters are not only lying to each other, but lying to themselves, and it has that trope of the unreliable narrator kind of backed into the narrative to such a degree that you are being driven mad as the movie unravels, because you have no idea what direction anything is going in, what's down and what's up. Like there's some references to old sea folklore and mythology. Like there's a Lovecraftian element to this movie that's really interesting with the lighthouse beacon itself. The mythological aspect to the movie that's being played into this is the light beacon is... The way I interpreted it, it was very much like it's kind of all information. There's this like fixation on information. Like Robert Pattinson's character wants to know everything. He wants to be the be all end all. He's a drifter. The lighthouse is the source for this information, but of course he can't handle all of the information, and that inevitably leads to his demise. The themes of the lighthouse are embedded very much in like this male branded frustration between the two characters. There's a way that you can look at this where the two characters' madness is being driven by alcoholism. And I mean, it gets to a point in this movie where their rations, in Dafoe's language, their rations run out and they start resorting to drinking kerosene. The hallucinogenic element to this movie can play a lot into what they're drinking every single night, because as you know, Pattinson is very reluctant to drink for the first couple of nights, and then succumbs to alcoholism by the time he finishes his shift and he's supposed to be departing the next day.
Yeah.
Then there's an element of this where, because this movie is so intrinsically connected to the characters, and there's a deep dive into this sort of self-absorption that the two characters have about themselves. Pattinson's character in particular has beans that he has to spill. You could argue that there's a weird way of looking at this movie where it's almost like Dafoe's character looking back at himself as a younger age and coming to wrestle with his past, like a younger version of himself that he has not accepted or has a hard time coming to grips with because of this identity crisis. Because I don't think it's a coincidence at all that they have the same name. And the visual cue for me that really made me think about this was actually the ending. At the end of this movie, Robert Pattinson's character finally gets the glory of going into the lighthouse chamber where he's able to look at the beacon itself. It's the one thing that he's been after. He wanted to acquire this from the beginning of the movie, and a lot of it was just out of like almost pure jealous rage or something. Him acquiring this leads to him being driven mad and falling from the lighthouse tower down the stairs, and you hear the bone crack when this happens. He snaps his leg on the way down. Throughout the entire movie, Defoe's character has been focused. They make a point to focus on his broken leg, his gimp leg. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. There's something really interesting about
I didn't even think about that.
The parallels between these two characters are so interesting.
Here I am. I'm like, loneliness is bad, and you definitely have a lot more to say about it. But,
there's just I keep finding things because I haven't even.
I almost had the cheesy take like maybe he's not there, like a
Sure.
Defoe, because recently having friends around and we live in the Maritimes, traveling about, you often see that the lighthouses were manned by an individual.
Yes.
So I thought about that going into this, that it's like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, you do see at the beginning the two other people leaving that were previously manning the lighthouse. I know that's just something that crossed my mind.
No, I actually agree 100% because there's obviously this sort of notion of like these men are taking shifts almost. Like they are, it's I guess a routine thing that they swap out a pair to man the lighthouse. So it kind of winds up playing into this isolated mentality about people who have to work these kinds of jobs and things like that. So there's a way that you can look at it from that angle because there is obviously an attention to detail that Eggers focuses on where he gets everything nailed down to a T, like what it would actually be like to work these kinds of jobs.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk about the production design. As you know, the production design is... that sort of stuff is my bread and butter when it comes to these movies, and I was kind of waiting to talk about it.
Totally, yeah. One last small point, I guess, to make, because I did touch on it a little bit in my analysis, was there's obvious ties to Greek mythology here. The lighthouse, from the interpretation that I've made about that being a sort of resource of answers, it's basically the all-knowing, it's the all-seeing eye. Pattinson acquiring that and failing to do so and being cast out onto the island bed and being picked apart by the very seagulls that he obliterated earlier in the movie. And we have to talk about that when we talk about production design because there's a pretty great scene in this movie involving a seagull.
Yeah.
He's being pecked apart, not too dissimilarly from the story of Prometheus acquiring fire and giving it to man, which is a really obvious reference, but it's there, and it's visually, the visual splendor of seeing that interpreted through the lens of like a more seaside folktale is really, really cool. And I the black and white certainly makes that pop. Like it looks great.
The cinematography is so good.
It's
one
beautiful.
thing the Oscars actually got right. Anyways, there was this one little tidbit to go back to Pattinson acquiring the sort of light. And this was in an interview with Eggers when Pattinson was asking, what is he actually seeing? And apparently what Eggers told him that what he is seeing is so pleasurable that it starts to become incredibly painful and then incredibly frightening afterwards.
Yeah.
And that was apparently the only instruction that Pattinson had. And we talk about performances. I mean, just the look on his face where they do, and I do have to mention, there's David Lynch all over this movie.
Oh, yeah.
That sort of fade to white when he's like looking into the light and just screaming. It has echoes of like Eraserhead and like Twin Peaks and stuff like that all over.
Eggers actually referenced The Lost Highway when talking about this movie and how he wanted this movie to feel very hallucinogenic.
Yeah.
And he likes movies that seem to have an interpretive measure to them where he doesn't like giving answers. He likes a lot of the fun for watching movies for him is actually unraveling the puzzle. I'm not paraphrasing him or quoting him directly, but this is kind of the gist of what he was saying, where he cited David Lynch in one of his interviews, where a lot of the things he likes about David Lynch movies is the interpretive aspect of watching them and how it is very much like a puzzle that you're putting together, and it's not about finishing the puzzle, it's about putting the puzzle together.
Well, like Lynch is a perfect example of somebody who does make a lot of like portrait pictures, not to go back to that term again.
Yeah.
But you take something like Mulholland Drive, you take something like Inland Empire, like those movies are definitely an impressionistic take.
Totally.
And less of like, this is a movie I walked away from. I mean, look at what the guy did with Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me. Instead of making a straight sequel, he just made this sort of like fever dream about like, well, incest basically, and the death of the American dream, but like threw so many people off.
I can imagine. Good Lord.
So Skylar, because there's a lot to cover in this movie, and especially, like I said, the technical end of it, is there anything else you want to bring up before we moved on?
One last thing, and it's about flatulence.
There is a lot of flatulence. There's flatulence and men fluid.
Lots of man fluid and very strange mermaid sex. For those of you who are, not to kink shame, for those of you who are into that, you might be into that. I don't know. But the flatulence angle of this is really interesting.
Do not feel free to write in and let us know if you're into mermaid sex.
Speak for yourself. Hey, I love The Shape of Water, remember? So
that's true. You did really love that movie.
Yeah. So with that said, flatulence is something I bring up in all seriousness just because we did touch a little bit on the comedic element of this movie, because there is a comedic element to this. There's a very... It kind of cuts the tension like a knife once in a while, where you are reminded that there was some levity to kind of bolster the anxiety. Flatulence is something to bring up for this, because there's tons of... This movie isn't beneath fart jokes. Right out the gate, I think there's a fart before there's dialogue, actually.
There is.
And Willem Dafoe's character is just riddled with gas. And they use it effectively to the point where it's not played up entirely for laughs. It's actually a use of domination. It plays into that toxic masculinity angle, where right from the get-go, Willem Dafoe's character is dominating Robert Pattinson. He's using this angle of constantly breaking wind, giving him... There's so many weird angles to look at this thing, because like there's an angle of this too where like there's a line in the movie where Robert Pattinson actually refers to himself as a housewife. Yeah. There are coupling. There's a focus on them as a couple.
I mean, the best part, dialogue-wise, of the entire movie is when, Willem Dafoe or Thomas is, basically does his Shakespearean type rant, when he thinks that Pattinson doesn't like the way that he cooks
the lobster.
And takes it so personally. But again, like to go to the screenplay, it goes to such Shakespearean proportions. Like, dude, I want to see Eggers do a version of the Tempest.
Oh, hell yes.
Like, he would direct the shit out of a version of the Tempest.
Yes. Because it's the way he researches the Shakespearean the period dialogue, the way he handles it. It's so well researched and so well put together that the authenticity of it.
Yeah, and some of the lines are lifted straight from old letters and stuff like that. Like, when we say you really researched it, like, no, he pulled a lot of this dialogue, and the dialogue is crazy. And again, not to go back to Shakespeare, but the rhythm of how these lines have to be said is not too far from iambic pentameter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To convincingly do it. And that was the other thing that I noticed while watching it this time, that I was reminded of watching Shakespeare. Because, I'll be honest, I'm an amateur Shakespeare nerd. I don't follow all the dialogue. I don't know what everyone is saying. Again, it's more of an impressionistic thing. You get the gist of what is going on, and you get into the production, and you get the love of the language, and, hopefully good actors doing their thing. And I thought of that a lot when watching The Lighthouse, too.
Oh, totally. You read it a lot through the character dialogue and just the way that they carry themselves too. There's just an authenticity to every little detail of this, which is probably a really nice segue to discuss like production design.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Good Lord.
Well, let's start cinematography. Mr. Jaron Blaschke.
Yes.
Nominated for an Academy Award. Good for him.
Good for him.
I mean, I don't think there's a better looking movie this year.
No. I think it is easily the best looking movie this year.
Yeah, and so many inventive things.
Yeah.
Like the way that they play with lighting, the way these things are.
It's absolutely stunning. And we just got done discussing the period drama aesthetic of this thing and how Shakespearean it is in proportion. This thing is so authentically period that it is literally using turn of the century lenses.
Yeah.
That's incredible. They had to archaically construct equipment to get specific shots in this movie because the set was so tight and so confined.
Well, and the lighthouse they built from the ground up.
Oh, yeah.
This is not a pre-existing structure, and it was built so they would actually be able to have corners to put the camera.
Yes.
And that's why they had to build something from scratch, because they knew it was going to be close quarters, but they still had to move this damn camera somewhere.
Oh my God.
Because they wanted to shoot it on film, so they couldn't do the route of just using digital where you can get into all these nooks and crannies.
Having shot a short film in a tiny ass room, I can confirm that it does get pretty boxed in. I've had to kneel down in corners and in uncomfortable situations just to get that shot, and I can't imagine doing that with expensive equipment on the set, especially with all the lighting rigs and all of the things that they had to use to emulate the period and really capture the essence of everything that they were trying to get in camera. And I know Eggers likes to use a lot of natural lighting, but I mean, I can't speak to the technicals and I guess to that extent, but I would really love to see like a breakdown of the blocking on this thing, because it would be really, really inspiring.
Well, one thing doing research with this, and it really stands out, is that Eggers began as a designer and a director of theater. Theater production. That stands out. I was really reminded when I was watching it of Tom Ford.
Yes.
Specifically A Single Man, which is a movie that I adore. And I've shared to you the story before about, watching, A Single Man in the theater and just wanting to touch fabric.
Yes.
Touch my jeans and my jacket, and stuff like that, because it's so tactile. And you get a lot of that same sort of feeling here. Like, not only is everything meticulously and lavishly spread out, but this dude knows how to frame shit. And he knows how to bring those things to life in the texture. Like, so many times I'm watching this, especially later on when my brain was not thinking about the plot as much, being like, God, what must it smell like?
Right?
Like, oh God, this movie just stinks from beginning to end with that sea air smell that you get out here, mixed in with just putridness and rot of seaweed. Not to mention what these men must smell like, with their lack of bathing. There's that one scene where, after they get drunk and everything becomes all washed out, and Pattinson stands up and he's just in his underwear and this sort of onesie, long underwear. And I'm like, oh God, what that must smell like must be horrible.
He literally describes what Willem Dafoe smells like at one point. And even though, like, obviously censorship, we don't really care about swearing and stuff, I don't want to actually describe or paraphrase the line because it's so disgusting. It actually makes you kind of throw up in your mouth a little bit. This movie does have an aroma. I never really thought about it until you described it, but it absolutely does, especially for those
Thank
of
God
us...
William Castle didn't get smell-o-vision off the ground, eh?
Oh, I know.
To any sort of big degree.
Oh, no.
Hey, Cameron, where's your technology being used? Give us smell-o-vision.
Give us smell-o-vision so we can go sniff this movie or whatever.
So we can smell the majesty of Pandora.
That's right.
Screw you, Cameron, you slacker.
Oh, man.
Anyways, that was a corner I didn't think we were going to get to.
Jesus.
And of course, historical detail. I'm a production
holy
design guy. You can just pick apart. And talking about the framing, like, we didn't even bring up the aspect ratio. Like, this guy knows how to film a frame, every single little bit in it. No space is unused. His Academy ratio, which is what?
It's 1:19:1.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's right. It was great to see it in the theater, but I feel that experience of claustrophobia that gives really translates well.
It was such a brilliant use of it too, because it's like you said, like, it plays into the claustrophobia because we're used to that sort of like 16:9 wide angle lens aspect ratio, and that works.
Well, and
obviously.
it shows you don't need to have the aspect ratio of Lawrence of Arabia to feel epic.
No, not at all. No, because this movie, it's so lavishly stylized with that macabre, high contrast black and white too. Like, you just don't get movies like this anymore. It's a total experience watching this thing, because I haven't seen a movie like this before. There's nothing out there like it.
I always say that the biggest compliment I can give anything, I've been around, I've seen a lot of movies and, listened to a lot of music and experienced a lot of art. And if I can walk away from something being like, I've never seen that before, that's probably the highest praise I can give something, good or bad.
100%.
If I liked it or didn't like it. Nothing is worse as you get older than mediocrity, and you either get sucked in and settle in it, or it just pisses you off all the time. And fortunately, I went right instead of left, and mediocrity just pisses me off all the time.
I agree 100%. There's nothing worse that I can give a movie in terms of a grade than middle of the road.
Yeah.
Like, movies that I loathe, I'm still passionately loathing them. And there's something to talk about.
Skylar, I saw Cats over the holidays. I know exactly what
you were one of 12 people who saw that.
In my theater. Yeah.
Yeah.
Morbid curiosity got the better of me, but that movie will never, by rules, ever be talked about on this podcast. That is the end of the Cats conversation.
Thank goodness. But whether or not this movie works for you or not, because obviously there is a little bit of a, I guess you could say, art house sort of interpretive, very, very hallucinogenic this movie's insane.
Yeah.
And it's not going to work for everybody, but for cinephiles or people who like really appreciate cinema that really want to see something different, whether or not it registers with you on an emotional level or not is irrelevant. It will undeniably be something you haven't seen before. And like whether or not it jives with you 100%, like we're obviously very positive and enthusiastic about it. See this movie because you're going to get an experience out of it.
Well, and I said my estimation actually grew over multiple viewings. I appreciated it when I first saw it.
Yeah.
Now after the third time seeing it, I fucking love this movie.
It's incredible.
Like 100%. Okay, just for time, want to hammer through a couple of things.
Sure.
The score by Mark Corvin.
Oh shit, yes.
Amazing. Again, anything that this movie could be considered for any sort of award show, any sort of awards, whatever. This movie deserves to be on that list. And the score, I just want to say, Mark Corvin did the score for The Witch.
Yes.
Which was really good. And Skylar, do you know what else Mark Corvin did the score for?
No.
Cube. Oh. He did the score for Cube.
Segue.
Mother effing Cube. We will do Cube on the show at one point. Sorry, whenever there's a Cube connection, I have to point it out.
Of course. Canadian cinema and all that. Yeah.
Classic Canadian cinema, like Cube.
That's right.
I do love Cube. Sorry, I make fun of it.
It's pretty wonderful. The sound design in this movie is absolutely insane. You can hear every sea crash, every wave hit that island.
I am not kidding. From the subsequent viewings, I am more impressed with the sound design than almost anything else.
Yeah.
In this movie.
It's
I know
miraculous.
That sounds weird to say. We're talking everything from the clanking of glasses, the sounds of like things going onto a table, shuffling across the room.
Yeah.
Even like the way, when they drop a mermaid statue and it goes clack, 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 clack. Like for whatever reason, and I don't have a big TV setup. I don't have surround sound stereo, but for whatever reason, I was more impressed with it when I was watching it at like midnight at my home than I was when I was in the theater with the surround sound. And I think maybe because I watched it alone, I wasn't surrounded by people, that maybe it came out, or maybe subsequent viewings I was paying attention to it more. But the sound design on this is this masterful.
Yes.
Good God.
The wind. There's that infamous shot where obviously Pattinson had committed a pretty heinous deed to the sea gods by just obliterating the shit out of the seagull.
Done killed a seabird.
Then you have the storm, the impending storm that is a result of, you could argue, I mean, one way or another, whether it be coincidence or not, it's a result of his violence
Skylar,
towards the bird.
That fucking one-eyed bird deserves Academy recognition more than most of the people that were nominated this year.
Fuck yes.
Sorry, it just happens to be on the day that they announced the Oscar nominations, and I weirdly give a shit about this stuff, even though I'm trying not to.
I know, me too. I trust me, we could have a whole separate podcast on our opinions on the Oscar nominations, I'm sure. To get back to my point, these two are standing on the island and just getting pelted with wind. And if you're, I don't know what part of the world our listeners are from. All I know is that if you're a Nova Scotian, if you're a Maritimer, you have been in that wind.
Well, this is what I wanted to bring up. For people that listen to the Ginger Snaps episode and Skylar and I discussing there, Skylar is from Canso, which we talk about quite a fair bit in the Ginger Snaps episode, but is a very small, I guess, formerly fishing village.
Yes.
Not too far from where this movie was filmed, like coastal Nova Scotia. And I've been there once. I went there for a wedding where I met Skylar. Again, if you want to hear the story, that's Ginger Snaps. Like, I remember standing while I was waiting for people to do their wedding stuff, because I was like a date, so I'm just kind of killing time in Canso, while everybody else is doing their thing. And just standing on the rocks with the wind blowing.
Yep.
And unless you stand there, like I live in Halifax, but you don't get that.
No.
So like, what did you think watching this movie? Because I thought about your home when I was watching this movie, and I'm not even from your home. Like, what do you take from this?
I had a very personal reaction to this. Like Hunter said, I'm from Canso, Nova Scotia, I'm trying to find a good way to describe it. It is the most easterly tip of Nova Scotia. You basically drive until you can't drive anymore without going over a cliff. And growing up in a place like this at a population of, now I don't know what the population was there when I was growing up, but now it probably sits somewhere around like 500 or 600. It's very small. It's teeny, teeny, tiny. And that's including surrounding areas too. It was a very prolific fishing community. So the fishing industry is embedded into its bones. And this is so connected to my DNA that it bleeds into everything that I'm passionate about in a lot of ways. And I've become more in touch with this as I've gotten older. It was something that I think was a little, as a young 20-some-year-old, maybe I was a little bit I found it to be a little apprehensive. I was apprehensive to accept my lineage and my bones. Now I've accepted it with open arms, and I'm very much connected to the sea in a lot of ways. There's a lot of passion I get out of that air that you spoke of earlier, like this movie smelling like the sea salt in the air, that moisture, that spray. You can almost feel it on your face as you're watching them stand into it. Like Robert Pattinson getting pelted with wind and rain. Like, I can't tell you how often I stood in that, and that smell, I still remember it. It's just embedded into my head because there's a different sense that you get to the environment living in a fishing community. There's a different smells. Like, it's almost enhanced. Because I've lived in Halifax now for about 12 years, and you definitely still get quite a bit of the same sort of like atmospherics, but it's just not the same. And watching this movie in a lot of ways for me was a close connection to home in a weird way. Not to like talk in a weird way that might be a backhanded comment towards my hometown, because obviously this movie does not shed this lighthouse environment into a positive light. It's a very like hellish landscape in a lot of ways, which is not Canso at all. It's quite beautiful, but it's the way they visually capture the emotions through the characters, and just it's the way the weather system and the way Mother Nature is.
And not to sound cheesy, but the way that the environment is a character unto it. So.
It really is.
Like, I was reminded watching this because I spent a few years living on the west coast of this country in Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia, and there's a saying that I really liked, which is, out west you get wet.
Yes.
Out east, you get damp. And you can dry off, but that dampness will stick around forever.
It really does. It gets in your bones.
And you really, that sort of coldness. You're not actually cold, but you're cold. It's really, really weird. Do you have too much more to say?
Not really, no. I think we kind of summarized all of our feelings on the initial, I guess, analysis and production of the movie itself. Yeah,
I mean, the one thing I want to say, I don't know how much I really stick to this. When I first watched it, the ending just really didn't sit well with me.
Right.
There was something that just didn't settle right after multiple viewings. I get it, especially with your whole analogy about, maybe being the same guy, which I never really thought about before. I really like, although I'm not a backseat director, but when I first watched this movie, I thought that the perfect way to end this movie would have been have all the shit go crazy. You think that he's killed Willem Dafoe, spoilers, and then, he screams into the light, and then it cuts to a bookend of the first shot of the movie, or one of the first shots of the movie, where you just see Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe leaving the lighthouse as the next people to take over are walking up towards the lighthouse, and they just walk past each other in total silence like they did when they were getting onto the island at the beginning.
Right. Which is I still think is a great alternate ending to this thing. I have grown to love the ending that Eggers put together. I don't think that there's a way that you can end this thing, given what he's presented, especially the hallucinogenic element of this. I think it's the best way to end it.
Oh yes, I agree now. That was just my take at the time. And you know what? The final thing to bring up, when I did my research, this movie made $7 million off of a $4 million budget.
Yeah.
Yay us.
Yeah, it's great.
Dave Eggers, apparently his next film might be a version of Nosferatu.
Oh, hell yes.
Oh, I'm all over that.
Sign me up big time. He's going to do the vampire mythology proud. Yeah, that's terrific.
With his research, I wouldn't be surprised if he dug up Klaus Kinski to come back and play like he did in the Herzog film.
Oh, I can't wait.
Okay, so that's The Lighthouse. Just as a cap, because you have a very special experience with this.
Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, you kind of covered what it was like seeing The Lighthouse at the premiere, but you got something a little special. I remember I was at work. I was at my shitty job, which thankfully I'm no longer with. And you just kept sending me these texts. I was like, oh my God, Eggers is here. And then you kept like sending photos of him and Willem Dafoe on stage. And then you sent a text which said...
I got to meet Eggers and speak to him for about 15 or 20 minutes.
And you made my night. I got the biggest smile. Then crappy job.
Oh my God, I was beside myself. It was something that was, I think, a high point for me last year. In an otherwise shitty 2019 for me, it was a genuine high point. And the obviously, I've already touched on my feelings on what it was like to see the movie. It obviously left an impact on me. But seeing it there and watching it with them in the same theater was something that was almost otherworldly in a lot of ways. And having the two of them stand there, and I mean, Willem Dafoe is charming as all hell. Like that guy just genuinely, he just radiates like positivity. He's such a actor in like the most positive sense. I had a lot of takeaways from the Q&A that was given for the two of them. And I should point out that like going into the screening, I knew Dafoe was there, but I had no idea that Eggers was there. Mm-hmm. So that was a genuine surprise for me. And I'm one of those weirdos that I get more excited about meeting not to say that our actors aren't creative types, because they certainly are. Like, they're in an artistic medium, of course.
We didn't even talk about the two different acting processes.
Oh, yeah,
because actors involved. After every episode, we're always like, oh, we could have talked about this. We could have talked about this. Shove that one aside.
There's definitely a lot to talk about. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to discuss with this movie that we didn't even talk about the most like obvious thing to go to, which is the performances, because they're just incredible. But Eggers being there as part of the Q&A was really something that heightened the whole experience for me, because I'm always really drawn to the creatives. Like, I want to know the process. Ever since I was a kid, I was like this. It's why I'm in the industry that I'm in visual effects, because I always wanted to see the strings in the marionette show, the puppeteer. I want to know the tricks, and having Eggers there was something else. And then Hallie was there with me as well, my co-host on Silver Screen Anomalies, and that played into some hilarity because we wound up going to the gala together. She has a little bit more experience with celebrity types than I do. I'm noticeably a little bit more awestruck in these situations. Willem Dafoe, I think I would have been fine with, just because he's such a charming guy that he could probably carry the conversation all by himself. But I wasn't expecting, when we got to the gala, being tucked on the outside of the party. We didn't really go into the condensed area.
Did you meet Dafoe?
No, because we couldn't get anywhere near him. He was there for such a brief period of time and then jumping on a red eye on a plane to somewhere else, that there was such a limited window to see him.
I bet he just flies. Like, he literally just walks outside and just...
I wouldn't be surprised.
Under his own power.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a great story about Dafoe that I'll touch on. But to get to the experience itself, we couldn't really get into the more condensed area of the gala, so we kind of just hung out around the outer perimeter. And you really get this when you hear Robert Eggers talk. But he's a very... how do I put this? Like, he's definitely very noticeably like an introverted type. And so he isn't like as astute on the public speaking angle as like a Willem Dafoe, which is, to be fair, nobody is. And he was kind of like hiding on the outskirts with us. And I was my peripherals were so just on the heightened experience of going to the Q&A and just coming off of the heels of seeing the movie that I didn't even process for a second that the guy was standing right behind me. So Hallie, very like cautiously and very calmly, just taps me on the shoulder and says, "So Skylar, I'm just going to ask you to not freak out for a sec." And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to freak out. I'm fine. Like, when do I do that? And laughing because I do that all the time. And Hallie then gestures to me so the director's right behind you. And I do the most obvious head turn, side glance, almost Fleabag levels of like wink at the audience levels of excitement, where I just turned back to Hallie and I almost lost my shit. Like, I was losing my mind a little bit. And he was almost in like a small little queue where people were just kind of lining up to pick his brain. And we were next in line, as it turns out, and I had no idea that I was even in the lineup. So by the time we actually got to him, I had to obviously calm my nerves down enough to talk to the guy, which apparently, according to what Hallie said, I did a pretty good job. But what an experience that was.
You never know from your own head in those situations. You're just bouncing in your own brain. You don't know how you're coming across.
And then following the discussion with Robert Eggers, which was really, really inspiring, being really interested in filmmaking myself and it being something that's always been in my DNA, picking his brain and hearing from him, getting advice from him about doing short films, and just constantly coming at it from the angle of like, learn from your experiences on each short film, because they all are lessons unto themselves. Basically, like, just keep making more films over and over and over again. Keep putting art out there. Was really, really inspiring, and was something that's kind of a driving force for our mission statement going forward for like the entire Eldritch creative, I guess, side project.
Which, by the way, I love the new logos.
Thank you.
Speaking of lighthouses, If anybody out there has any interest, look up Eldritch Creative. Skylar does a lot of the design behind a lot of what you see when you go on there. I still want that on a mug.
Thank you. We're working on that. Merchandise is coming down the pipe for those that are interested. Anyway, that's the story. I mean, without getting into like absolute details, it was just a really mind-boggling, super inspiring.
No, and it's so awesome. I mean, one of the greatest surprises and joys that I've had from recording this podcast so far is interacting with some of the people that have made some of the movies that we've covered on here.
Totally.
You know, and you kind of did yours in reverse a little bit, but it's amazing that both of us over the last year have met people that, you know, we have been inspired by.
Yep.
You know, we got to pick their brains about the industry a little bit. You know, I've been so touched that from this podcast, I've had some creators actually reach out to me.
Yeah.
You know, and actually say, hey, you know, I really like listening to the show that you recorded about my movie.
Yeah.
Which is mind blowing. You know, maybe Eggers will listen to this. Who knows?
I really hope so. Yeah, so he can fully appreciate and understand just how much I was internally screaming the entire time that I was talking to him. Yeah.
Well, Skylar, you were the perfect person to have to come on to talk about The Lighthouse.
I love talking about
this. There could not
be
be a better guest, both because of your experiences and your views on the film. Do you have any take as to what this movie says about Canada, or is it all up there on the screen?
I mean, it's all up there on the screen. In closing, I think there is some important notes that I will bring up that speaks to something that Eggers brought up at the Q&A screening itself.
Great way to end.
Which is about the importance of our film tax credit cut. So in closing, overall, I can go on for days about this movie and everything I love about it and how brilliant it is. It's an unmatched piece of cinematic gold, in my opinion. It should be studied by cinephiles. What the movie represents for Canada is the capacity. We as Nova Scotians and we as Canadians, we have the capacity to create critically acclaimed, award-winning, worthy cinema, essentially. And I mean, the proof is in the pudding. This movie is nominated for an Oscar. It should be nominated for more, in my opinion. But it specifically represents the work ethic of Nova Scotians as well, and the importance of the film tax credit cut. Now, for the perspective of the audience, several years ago, our tax credit cut was removed, which has directly affected the film industry locally to such a degree that many jobs were lost. Eggers made a point to bring this up, and
it gutted the joint.
It really did.
Yeah.
Thankfully, there are people who still love this medium and love this art form that are still trying to keep it alive as much as they possibly can, but it is extremely hard to get funding. Eggers brought up in the Q&A that the only reason he was able to shoot here was because he hired entirely Nova Scotian staff, which created a loophole where he was able to get some funding to shoot the film exactly where he wanted to shoot it. But had it not been for that loophole, it wouldn't have been made here, and it wouldn't have had the same aesthetic and the same feel.
Well, the movie about Maud Lewis a few years ago, Maudie.
Yeah.
Starring Sally Hawkins and Ethan Hawke. You know,
Yeah.
It was a big deal out here. The most famous painter in the history of this province, and they had to shoot it in Newfoundland.
I know.
They couldn't shoot it in Nova Scotia because they couldn't get the proper funding for it. So thank God Eggers figured out a way to do that and just put our brutal, beautiful landscape on screen.
Because it wouldn't have been, I mean, anyone who's seen this knows full well that the island and the set are so connected to the DNA of this movie that it just wouldn't have been the same anywhere else. So basically, like, this is our cinema, this is our art, these are our stories, and the government trivializing this is borderline unacceptable, in my opinion. This movie is a masterwork made by one of the best working directors of today, in my opinion, and it's made here in Nova Scotia, so it's pretty obvious that we have a lot to offer, and it's a testament to not only our work ethic, but what can be achieved in Canada as a whole in the film industry.
Great, and a great note to end on, Skylar.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of summarizes everything.
Yeah, it sure does. Well, thanks again, and don't go too far, because I don't think it'll be too long before you're back on the show.
Oh, I'm sure you'll get me back on for something down the road.
We might have discussed a couple of things.
But, thanks to everyone for having me again, and thank you for having me again.
Of course. Thanks for providing a home where I can talk, and you know what? It was a little bit of a break, but it's great to be back.
It sure is.
I was a little bit nervous, but I feel like I got back on the horse okay.
Yeah, this was great.
Okay, well, North of Normal is a product of Eldritch Creative, which can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. This show can be found at North of Normal on Facebook and on Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for now.